Is Hedron Archive still a good card in Commander? Find out next on Commander Replay. So is Hedron Archive still a good card? Yes. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel... So, in yesterday's video, which featured some of the worst technical gameplay of any video that I've ever posted on the channel, somehow the takeaway for people was that I said I liked Hedron Archive better than Worn Power Stone. Somehow, saying Hedron Archive is a good card became a controversial statement. I was not informed of this change, and nor did I consent to it. But here we are. So today I'm going to look at why Hedron Archive is still a good card. If you've ever watched an episode of the Command Zone, they have a wildly successful podcast devoted entirely to ramp and card draw, and while I tried to fight this notion early on in my Commander days, the more I played, the more I found it to be true. Being able to produce the most mana makes you more likely to win simply because you can do more things faster. Now, one thing that happens occasionally when you ramp super hard is that you run out of cards, and that's where the card draw comes in. Ramp gives you the ability to cast the cards, card draw gives you the ability to have more cards to cast. So in a game that may go 7 to 10 turns, you're gonna want a lot of both, and that's why I present to you Hedron Archive. A card that is literally both ramp and card draw. Yet somehow there are still many detractors to this card. So let's take a look at some of their arguments against Hedron Archive. You need to ramp on 2. Ramp on 2, in general, is good, and it's especially helpful if your commander costs 4, because then you can get your commander on turn 3. Now, while all those things are great, if you only draw one ramp card for your first 6 or 7 turns of the game, and that card happens to be a signet, any player who dropped a multi-producing piece of ramp along the way is going to outproduce you as the game drags on. And you know what happens when you move the S and drags on? Dragons. Multi-ramp is just mathematically better in any game that isn't going to end in the next turn cycle. Now, there will be a small period of time where you may feel behind if someone casts a signet on 2 and you're waiting for your Hedron Archive on 4, but this can be easily fixed by running 6 or 7 board wipes. You drop any removal on them at all, and that's going to get rid of any early lead that they had. Magical Hacker made a great analogy to this on Twitter. He said, "Commander isn't a foot race, it's a game of Mario Kart. The player with an early lead is most likely not to finish first because people are going to fire removal at them to slow them down. Or in Mario Kart's case, turtle shells. This means that Hedron Archive is a great passive play that allows you to set up your later turns without looking too threatening to the rest of the table. Some people will say you don't want to pay 4 to ramp. Yet, many of those people will still play Thran Dynamo and Smothering Tithe. Those cost 4 to ramp. People seem to think that dropping a signet on turn 2 and dropping their 4-mana commander on turn 3 is GG. It's not, CEDH decks notwithstanding. And it's especially not GG if you fire any removal at all in their direction. So, most casual games of Commander still go 7 to 10 turns. A signet that stays in play for 3 turns at any point after turn 2 will produce 3 mana, whereas a Hedron Archive that stays in play for 3 turns, the Hedron Archive will produce double what the signet does. It's also worth noting that the Hedron Archive mana is useful the turn that it comes down, whereas the signet on turn 2 with no additional ramp is not. In my case, I might do something like drop a Remorseful Cleric on 2, play a Feast and Famine on 3, play a Hedron Archive on 4, equip the Feast and Famine, send in the Remorseful Cleric, and tell someone to get Sword Trigger. Yeah, you have to discard. My land's on tap. Another thing to look at is the Command Zone study from a few years ago found that players running Burnished Heart were more likely to win the game. Burnished Heart is about the slowest and worst rate of mana ramp available, but after playtesting a bunch, I realized that it doesn't matter how you ramp as long as you ramped. Sure, being efficient is great, but on turns 7 through 10, it really doesn't matter how you got there as long as you ramped and as long as you outproduce your opponents. And to that note, your overall production of mana matters so much more than how quickly you got to 4 mana. And a final thing to consider is that, as the game goes on, there will be many situations where you want to cast 2 specific cards in a turn, and you'll need their combined mana cost worth of mana to cast them. For example, let's say you want to get a Sun Titan and a Lightning Greaves into play on the same turn, you would need 8 mana. The Hedron Archive is going to help you with that much more than the signet will. Another thing that people say about Hedron Archive is it's not as good as Thran Dynamo or Smothering Tithe. Yes, the rate at which it produces mana is not as good as Smothering Tithe or Thran Dynamo, but there's a strange advantage here, which is the second you play a Smothering Tithe, everyone at the table's gonna try and shoot it. It's basically like doing a check for enchantment removal to see who has it. Thran Dynamo isn't quite as threatening, but I've still had my fair share of Thran Dynamos get blown up over the years by people who understand what it really does. Hedron Archive is less threatening than both of those, and therefore more likely to stay in play, which means you're actually going to get some benefit out of it. I figured out that it is not worth it for me to play Smothering Tithe on 4 and have it immediately get blown up, which it does about 50% of the time. That was literally a 4-mana do-nothing kind of play. So it's important that the cards you play actually stay in play so that you can use them. And Hedron Archive will do this a bit better since people are divided on whether they actually think it's a good card or not. Now, the other difference between Hedron Archive and the other two, yes, Thran Dynamo and Smothering Tithe produce more mana, but they can never be card draw. There are plenty of times where I've seen someone with 10 or more treasure tokens and literal nothing to do with them. Hedron Archive gives you some protection against that in that you can draw a couple extra cards. If it gets late in the game and everyone's empty-handed, those 2 cards can be a really big deal. So it does a great job of preventing you from getting stuck. Another argument against Hedron Archive is that it's a 6-mana divination. This is an incorrect explanation of how Hedron Archive actually works. Hedron Archive is primarily a ramp card, and the secondary mode is card draw, a backup if you will. There are plenty of games that I've played where I haven't needed the card draw mode, I just use it as ramp. However, there's just as many other situations where you're empty-handed and you just need to look at some additional cards. So you're not paying 6 mana to draw 2, you're paying 4 mana to ramp for a while until some point that you may run out of cards and then you draw some cards. Anyway, getting away from the detractors, here are some things that I really like about Hedron Archive. If you play it on turn 4 and make your 5th land drop, you can cast a 7-drop. That's an Avenger of Zendikar, that's an Elesh Norn, there's some really good things at 7 mana. So here's another thing with Hedron Archive, is that your playstyle matters. Personally, I still like a lot of commanders at 6 mana that hit hard, and probably have some way to get there with commander damage if you want them to. I also like decks that are full of powerful 6-drops and powerful 7-drops. And I don't play much green, so I need to find ways to ramp. Next, there's also this fallacy that because you're running Thran Dynamo and running Smothering Tithe, that you shouldn't also run Hedron Archive. I have decks where I need to run all of them. A great example is my Angel deck. A deck that seems like it shouldn't work on paper because it's full of 7, 8, and 9-drop angels, but because I run so many multi-producing pieces of ramp in the deck, it's actually a very effective deck for casual and mid-power settings. Now, there's only one signet in this deck, and when the Boros Talisman was printed, I remember scratching my head for a little while, trying to decide whether I should put that in the deck or not, and after a little bit of playtesting, I decided that it just didn't do enough, and I really need a multi-ramp card in that slot, because ramping from 2 to 4 does not help this deck that much. You really need to get to 6 and 7 mana as quickly as possible, and that's really where you need those multi-producers. So in this shot right here, I've highlighted all the multi-producers in this deck, and you see there's a bunch of them. And this is a great example of how strong multi-producing mana rocks can be, and of how you can build a high-curve ramp deck without using green. Now, like I said, this is a casual to mid-power deck, however, I have run it against plenty of high-power decks over the years, and while it's not going to win every time, because it is a deck full of 7, 8, and 9 drops, the second you can force those faster decks to go late, turn 8, turn 9 with just a little bit of removal, then the ball definitely falls into your court because you're producing so much more mana than they are, and your threats are so much bigger than theirs. But yeah, with the high power decks, CEDH, that type of stuff, signets and the cheap mana rocks definitely make a lot of sense. But the second you force the game to go just a little bit longer, that's where these multi-producing mana rocks like Hedron Archive, like Thran Dynamo, will really outshine the signets. And players running only signets will fall behind in the late game. Now on the opposite side of the coin, if you're someone that plays a deck with a really low curve, you may not need Hedron Archive. I'm not saying run it everywhere, but think about what your deck wants to be doing. Does it have a lot of big things in it? If it doesn't have access to green, Hedron Archive definitely makes a lot of sense for a lot of different deck styles. I noticed that I was running it in a ton of my Mardu decks. Mardu just seems to really like Hedron Archive. So yes, it's not that you need to run it in every single deck ever, but especially if you're trying to do bigger mana cost things with your deck, it is a multi-producing ramp spell that can be card draw. So anyway, yeah, I don't want to go too long on this. Here are the main reasons why I like Hedron Archive. Its strength is its flexibility. It's ramp early, and when you get stuck, it's card draw. Next, it's 90 cents. Smothering Tithe is like $15, and Thran Dynamo hovers between 5 and 10, depending on what period of time you're looking at. If you're on a budget, or you have 10 or more commander decks, you probably don't have Thran Dynamo and Smothering Tithe for all of them. Hedron Archive definitely makes sense in those two scenarios. Next, Multi-ramp is better than single ramp. If the game isn't going to end right now and you get a chance to untap, that multi-producer is going to be way better than that signet. Now, that doesn't mean signets don't have any value. You want a nice blend of both. But that is the key, having some of both. Next, Hedron Archive doesn't get destroyed nearly as often as Smothering Tithe and Thran Dynamo do. And you can also sack it in response to a destroy trigger so that you can draw some cards. I also like it because it's a good passive setup play that people don't perceive to be very threatening, and it really helps you on turns 7, 8, and 9 in the game, which is the time frame in which most casual decks try to win the game. And finally, your overall mana production matters. Signets are nice in that they do get you going a little bit quicker, but they don't contribute to your overall mana production in the same way that any multi-producing mana rock will. So you do need to have multi-producing mana rocks so that you don't fall behind in your mana production as the game drags on. Dragons. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below. Also, be sure to use the TCG affiliate player link as it helps support the channel and it doesn't cost you anything.